Welcome, everybody. This week, we're going to be talking about the fallout from the MSI group stage, what to look forward to in the bracket stage coming up next weekend, as well as some roster moves that have been happening in North America and Europe. All that and more coming up on this episode of League Weekly. How's it going, everybody? Travis is still out in Brazil, thank God. So you got me holding it down again by myself, because joining me today is nobody. I am alone in the studio. But we have some guests on Skype, or co-hosts on Skype, excuse me, not guests. They're better than guests. We have Kelsey and Emily joining me again. Kelsey, how are you doing?
I'm doing not bad. Enjoyed MSI this week, actually, so that was a good time for me.
Is MSI at a good time zone for you? Because you're obviously in China, and usually we host the show at 2, and it's 5 a.m. there. So what is it most of the time for MSI?
For MSI, it starts at about 2 a.m. for me, and then it keeps going until 9 a.m., so.
That's pretty brutal. How about you?
It's not bad.
It's not bad. What? You're literally awake the entire night.
Yeah. It's like watching Korea when I was in Boston.
Yeah, I can see it. I don't know. Anyways, how are you doing, Emily? You're in Brazil, right? Rio de Janeiro, or?
I am in Rio, yes. Don't ask me how Rio actually is, because I have been here or at the venue, and that's about it.
I mean,
hopefully I'll be able to see the city sometime this week before games start back up, but yeah.
I feel like that's how a lot of esports people are. I know that's how I would be if I was ever in like another country where I don't speak the language. I'd be like, the hotel sounds nice. I can do room service 5 days a week. Yeah, that sounds good. Anyway, so we're going to kick things off. First topic, no surprise here. Postmortem on TSM and Gigabyte Marines, the two teams that did not make it through to the bracket stage of MSI. It was pretty close overall, but we're going to kick things off talking about what went wrong, why they might not have made it, and what they can look forward to maybe the next time that they show up in international competition. So we'll start things off with everyone's favorite team to complain about when they lose, TSM. So why don't we kick things off? Kelsey, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what exactly went wrong for them.
And there are a lot of people complaining about draft and everything else, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I think just in general for TSM, there were a lot of very obvious flaws or play style issues just in general, like inability to play the game. I don't know. I guess that should be pointed out. They focused a lot on buffs as usual. Bjergsen kept the lane pushed out. I think Svenskeren had a hard time adjusting to the fact that in places that aren't NALCS, if you blind invade against pushing lanes, you'll probably get punished for it. It's just a weird concept, really.
To be fair, he struggled with that a little bit in North America too, but a lot less than like every single game almost this time around.
Yeah.
I think
that was a huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, another weird moment for me was in maybe it was their final game against Flash Wolves. One of their games against Flash Wolves. It happened in both, but there was just one of them where Flash Wolves have vision like all the way down the river, and they're just like, okay, we're doing our mid-game transitions now. We're rotating from lane to lane, and TSM were just like, what is going on? What is this? And they just didn't have any, like, even though I'd say they had the laning matchups, they didn't have vision set up where they should have. And it was just really unfortunate to watch, because Flash Wolves are not exactly a team that played well in this group stage. They came and they looked woefully out of place and really confused as to what was going on. And then to have them just, I guess, instinctively know what to do in that mid game and have TSM just look like utterly lost from that point on was like really unfortunate.
I wouldn't even say that happened, right? Because that Flash Wolves instinctively knew what to do, because there was a point in the game where I felt like Flash Wolves would have just kind of meandered around mindlessly and let TSM scale and whatever else if TSM didn't go to contest the Dragon. because the TSM went to contest the dragon. Flash Wolves had vision in place set up on that side of the map, and then Flash Wolves were like, oh, right, we can fight them now. And suddenly it was like, because Flash Wolves literally hadn't done anything for 5 minutes, I think, or something like that. So it was just like an issue of they couldn't find a situation where TSM would fight them, despite the fact that there was like vision setups to fight over, things like this. And they couldn't find a place on the map to pressure. Like, they weren't really pushing out lanes or anything, the Flash Wolves. And then suddenly TSM go for a Drake. Flash Wolves are like, oh, right, we can fight them. And they snowball from there, and suddenly they're winning the game pretty decisively. So I think that it isn't so much that Flash Wolves even knew what they were doing. It's just that TSM weren't necessarily aware of like where they could pressure the map and things like that inside lanes.
I mean, even expanding just beyond the Flash Wolves game, TSM as a whole felt like come like the mid-late game, their Baron control was either like awful where they would all recall and just give up Barons, or they would end up in almost 50-50 situations a couple of times. They had terrible Baron control. And then even once they got a neutral objective, they didn't use it well almost ever. They were constantly getting chunked out in front of like inhibitor turrets when they're trying to siege. So this team that for the most part in North America, when they got to the mid-late game, they were just like better team fighters than other people. Their objective control and like how to play with those objectives afterwards was really lacking on the international stage for me.
Well, I know like talking to, and I feel fine saying this because the interview is going to come out tomorrow anyway, but talking to Xmithie, and again, G2, another team that made a lot of mistakes. And he even said, he's like, I think we botched our draft. But the idea going in, because I asked him to explain, I don't know if you saw on broadcast, he did this thing where he was like, well, if we get to late game, you know, we'll be fine. And the reason he said that is actually because he was thinking, okay, at the very least, since TSM has such a lack of understanding of what to do once they get super late, and since TSM like likes to scale anyway, they were like, pretty much if we can match up, so we have like late game AD, like scaling mage, tank, etc. G2 figured they would be able to match up well against TSM or like outmaneuver them late.
It wasn't,
and I thought that was like a very interesting thing for him to say, because it's definitely something that like putting aside all of the like teams, a lot of teams here said like, oh yeah, you have to scale late. Like I thought that was a very interesting insight into how they approached TSM, because they're basically counting on them making those mistakes.
It was interesting to me though, because it didn't even feel like G2 were like super intelligently outmaneuvering them or anything. It was just that neither team would do anything until 45 minutes or something, and then they would fight over Baron, and G2 had a better late game team fighting comp. Like G2 themselves reflected that they didn't necessarily know what to do in certain games in mid game, like the one interview where Sven said, we didn't know how to like split against their high mobility comp. We didn't know how to do these sorts of things. And a lot of that had to do with the support champions that G2 were picking. So we just decided to ARAM it, like this kind of mentality. I felt like there was a lot of that in general.
Yeah, not
MSI.
just the G2 problem.
Not just G2, not just TSM. It was just like a very poor understanding of how to control side lanes, like at a certain point in the game. So I think it was just, that's what became comfortable for G2 was the late game team fighting. And I think this became kind of a possible crutch that a lot of teams could have taken just because there wasn't a lot of decisiveness in mid game.
All right. Well, before we flip over to Gigabyte Marines, last thing is we talked a lot about the team of TSM. What about in terms of individual players? Like, did you feel like anyone in particular was underperforming? Because for me, I thought I was actually pretty negative coming on into TSM for the event. They actually played at the level I thought they would. The surprising thing was that the other teams played actually close to their level. I thought Sven and I thought Turtle would be problems. They were. Hanser was a bigger problem than I thought it would be. How do you guys feel about the individual performances?
I mean, Sven Skaren getting caught out, I'm confused as to why people were so surprised about that. Right. Because again, like we saw it not even this spring, but last spring when he was trying, like And I know, yes, like people are going to write it off as like, well, that team had really poor communication and they just didn't figure out how to play together, which does happen. And, you know, a byproduct of that is that Sven obviously wasn't communicating with his lanes very well until playoffs came. But I was kind of surprised at how many people were seemed really shocked at the blind invades, because that's something he's been doing for a while. Turtle, I thought, was blamed just in general watching people react. I think he was blamed a little bit too much for a few things that were like team issues. So again, like not saying that his individual performance was good, but like there are a few times where he's in team fights and I feel like he was blamed for poor team fight positioning when maybe it was like he was expecting, you know, Biofrost to be there and do something, or, you know, Hanser to be there and do something. Like it was just a complete breakdown of communication in team fights that led to some of his more like obvious mispositioning. Obviously, his positioning was not stellar at this tournament. And then I actually thought Biofrost looked a little bit worse, especially on the final day.
Right.
Just again, in terms of team fight positioning, and when you are playing, you know, shielding comps, especially on like a Karma, for example, like it's actually really important. I think people underestimate the fact that, you know, the Karma has to be there and she has to be shielding the right people and speeding up the right people and all that stuff. So I thought this was the first time where I've actually like pointed out and been like, wow, he had like a really poor performance, because usually he's at least been okay. So I don't know if that was just nerves. I know he has already been at large international events, so maybe it was also the absence of like double lift in lane with him. I'm not really sure. But obviously they were under a lot of pressure, and I didn't think he performed particularly well on the final day specifically.
Yeah, it was a little surprising. I wouldn't think it's double lift given the fact that he was doing fine for the first couple days, and then his worst day is the last day when pressure's the highest. So you would probably think it got to him a little bit.
I think at Worlds too, there was some similar issues with Biofrost. So maybe it is a nerves thing, generally speaking. I haven't ever really been that impressed with Biofrost's laning either. So, I mean, that was less surprising to me. Definitely we should talk about the Hanser issue, because I think that was probably the most surprising thing to some people. I think part of it was just that a lot of tops were underrated going into this tournament. And if you can identify TSM's game plan, which is that like in many games or most of the games they play, like Svenskeren will be top at 4 minutes. Like you can actually find this. And then you come with a good matchup and a good counter gank, then maybe it's not as easy for Hanser to snowball. So that's part of the issue, right? But I think that there were other issues with like what champions they were prioritizing or what they thought was good as well for Hanser that made it difficult. And like they were playing these snowball picks all game and all tournament in top lane, and things kind of went south from there.
Yeah,
we'll not get TSM, but other teams. Yeah,
we'll get into the picks a little bit in the next topic. Why don't we swap over to Gigabyte Marines, unless you guys have any last words for TSM? Nothing in particular. All right, so Gigabyte Marines, the other team not to make it through the group stage. Probably the most entertaining team to watch, in the sense that, like, you know, when you watch their games, it's going to go down. There's going to be 20 kills in like 15 minutes, something insane. Their average was almost a kill a minute between the 10 games they played, which is insane. And then despite the fact that they pushed a lot of the teams, because like we said, a lot of teams are not super clean and they're getting a lot of these early game fights, they fell short because they were pretty clearly like not up to the level of the other teams once you get out like the first 10 minutes of the game. What'd you guys think about them?
I really appreciated the Marines. And I know I'm brought up this topic for later as well, because we have a lot to cover with MSI, obviously. So I appreciated that they stuck to themselves. I appreciated that among a lot of other teams coming in that were like, we have to adjust to the meta, we have to do this, we have to do that. The Marines were like, we're going to play like our play style. And talking to them, you know, they're very serious, they're very dedicated. The reason why they actually like picked up Stark, who's only played top lane for like a little over a month now, I think, like a couple months, is because he said, like, no, I want to make international events. I don't just want to be the best in Vietnam. And that's their goal. And that's what they come in with. So I think I appreciated how hungry they were. Like, they seemed like they have this aggressive play style. They embrace it. Obviously where they need to work on. So like, I appreciate them sticking to that play style, and I actually think it can work. I don't know about the lane swap, but
yeah,
I actually think it can work. But now what they need to work on is, tightening up their mid game. So obviously, just stuff like vision lines, when to rotate for objectives, like really simple things that every team struggled with. But I think every team but SKT pretty much, and WE to some extent. I think WE improved like significantly as the tournament went on, but or they looked better as tournament went on. But like really things that I think a lot of teams in major regions kind of focus on or attempt to focus on a lot more. I think they were even shakier than these other teams who we were already saying weren't necessarily doing the right thing come mid late game. It was even worse for Marines, in my opinion. I am pleasantly surprised though, because like when I first saw them coming out of groups, I was like, oh God, this team is bad. And I think part of that is because almost half of their games didn't matter.
Yeah.
So in the play-in, so.
And I think a lot of people kind of underestimated them because we saw the series versus TSM that went to 5 games, and we're like, oh my God, TSM's so bad. When both these teams get to the actual group stage, they're going to get crushed. And then both them actually were not, I wouldn't say better than what they showed in that best of 5, but other teams were actually closer to that level.
Everyone was.
Yeah, everyone was just way worse than we were expecting.
I think it was more that for the first few days, the first few times we played the Marines, they were surprising, right? Mm-hmm. I think Marines played a lot towards the shock factor. And you guys brought up the lane swap. I think the lane swap is actually a perfect example of what Marines were trying to do, which was to shock you, to put you like out of your comfort zone. In the game that they played against Flash Wolves where they did the lane swap, like Flash Wolves split up their resources and tried to both pressure the bot lane turret and like counter jungle the red buff at the same time, and they achieved neither. They just became really, really lost, right? So I think that was the entire objective of what Maroons were trying to do, is just like pressure you so hard that you fall off balance. But if you step back after you play against it a few times, you can kind of like decide, okay, they're going to do this. We just need to focus like a little bit more, like decide what we're going to do in terms of prioritizing objectives. We can make sure we get the better trade in this instance if they 5-man us here or if they invade the jungle here. And I think that was a big thing about Marines too, is just that once you are over the shock value of they're actually doing this play, you can react to it all right.
You just got to sit back and kind of weather that early storm. And the first couple times you don't know what to do. And then you realize if we just don't lose too hard early. Kind of talking about the lane swap, what'd you think of it? Did you think it was actually viable? Because I looked at it, and every time they did it, I was like, I don't know if this is even like a great situation for it. Oftentimes their lane matchups were actually fine when they did it. But then after the lane swap, it was mostly okay. Like they weren't behind in gold. Usually they came out ahead, but they usually did something during it that made it look bad, where Slay would be down like a ton of CS or something. He'd be coming back to lane down 20 CS versus opponent, or like their top laner would just miss a ton of XP. So how do you guys feel about the lane swap? Is it something people should be looking more into, or was this like as good as it's going to get and it still was not great?
I actually think I don't mind that style of lane swap. I think it'll be more interesting. I think it'll be even more interesting with the way we've changed the Rift Herald, actually, as a potential thing. I haven't thought this through entirely, so that probably sounds really dumb. It kind of sounds really dumb. But I think it might be something more interesting that comes up again with maybe other changes to the map and continues to be relevant as an idea. I wouldn't do it in situations where Marines tended to do it, because they would have like team comps or compositions that spiked earlier. I don't think you should do it in those cases because you're giving perhaps the team comp that scales a little bit better, that's going to have like the double tier comps, an advantage in the ability to get first turret and to get an early gold injection to help them out. So I don't necessarily think it's good in those situations where you're trading that for just like a kill on a carry. So you're centralizing your gold resources more maybe, but it's not, I don't think it's as good in those types of situations. So I didn't really like the way the Marines did it, but I still think that the strategy itself is interesting. And I think part of the reason why it kind of worked for the Marines a little bit was just because they did it in situations that made zero sense, and the enemy team was like really confused by it as well.
Even after like 3 games of them doing it, people were still like, "What? They're doing it right now? It's not good right now. I wasn't ready."
They said it worked really well for them previously. They were like when I asked them about it, because I was like, teams really lane swap for obvious reasons. They were like, yeah, it catches a lot of people by surprise, and it's a strategy that's worked really well for us. And I was like, okay, like I can't argue with that because it has actually worked weirdly enough for you here. I know, like talking to some of the other coaches, they were just like, our team should not have been fooled by that. It's just because no one lane swaps anymore. So it was very weird and unexpected. I will say that I think so, like disregarding the laning matchups, I thought they were really decisive about it, which was good. Like, I don't know, that's gonna, like, comparing that to the Fnatic swap. I think Fnatic paid a lot more attention to the champions that they were swapping, where Marines paid a lot more attention to like the execution of it and like, oh, we're just going to go up, immediately get the kill, and then like take it from there. So it was weird to see that. And I feel like if they'd paid more attention to laning matchups, or maybe if like, I still don't feel like I have a great read on like how many champions Stark can even play. He might not, because he hasn't played for that long professionally, right? So like Galio is something he learned like at the tournament. A lot of these champions are things like he learned at the tournament, and Gragas is obviously like his go-to champion, which is why I was so insistent that people ban it. But like I think maybe it would have worked better if they'd had more experience and paid a little bit more attention to the actual champions.
I mean, the execution wasn't even that good because they kept, like, they screwed up the wave bounce like almost every time. Yeah. Anyway,
I don't know. I agree. There were like times where the Galio got solo killed by the Fizz that they killed twice already. Like that shouldn't, if the goal of the lane swap was to hold down the Fizz, he has the XP lead now and he's level 6 all-inning, you're level 5 Galio. I wouldn't call that like, a successful swap at all. Even though it looked good when they got the 2 kills. So final thoughts for Gigabyte Marines. Assuming this team makes it back into Worlds because they kind of have a spot secure for themselves already, how do you think they match up against other teams, second and third, other regions, second and third teams? So if, a C9 went, if CLG, P1, whoever is going to be the third team out of NA, or similarly for EU, if you're running into Fnatic and stuff like that, do you think they'll actually outperform those teams, or will it be a kind of similar story where they look really explosive early in the tournament and then as people adjust to playing against them in their group, they lose effectiveness?
I think if they're as dedicated to improving as they are, and given the situation of their roster coming into this, and I'm not saying those as excuses, I'm just saying, like, I'm actually kind of, like, knowing more about the team, I'm kind of surprised that they performed as well as they did, just because the decisiveness and unity out of that team is not something I would expect from even a veteran player swapping to support and then having a brand new top laner from solo queue. I think that if they're as dedicated as they say they are at improving, and if they make the most of their practice, I think we could see them again for sure. As for how they compare to other teams, I I don't know, man, because like going into this tournament, I was like, they're gonna get stomped, and then it turns out everyone is just terrible. So I think that major regions, LMS third seed is going to be interesting because they have a third seed this year for the first time. And
NALCS third seed is going to be interesting.
Yeah. Like NAL, like all of these. So NALCS, LMS third seed, like, because right now there are 2 teams in the LMS. So I'm curious to see, like, it's probably going to be J team, but like, how good are they? Or NALCS third seed would have either been like, so there was a really like long best of 5 and Phoenix won or FlyQuest.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know.
You
like,
don't feel super confident.
They almost beat TSM in a best of 5. Like, they could probably beat one of those teams in a best of 5 if things go their way. And like, I don't know. If anything, this tournament pointed out, like, and I know people say this is a joke, but I'm being serious. Like, the level of the top teams in minor regions, like, you no longer can blow them off. Like, you no longer can sit there and not study them or just assume this is going to be a free win. Like, stop doing that. Pay attention, because these teams are on that, like, they're at that level now. So, I mean, no, I won't be surprised if we see them again at Worlds.
I think the one thing that I would just hold on to for Marines in general is that we have seen a consistently, like, at this point, the level coming out of wildcard teams, at least one per tournament, there will be a consistently, like, somewhat competitive level. So I think in general, we should be raising our expectations for wildcard based on Gigabyte Marines performances. Or as Freak wanted to make sure I knew, the emerging regions.
Emerging.
Emerging regions. This is now the politically correct term for...
Instead of wildcard?
I mean, Vietnam has been a region since season 1. So.
But it's just emerging.
Yeah, exactly.
You can exist for a while. You only emerge later. For like when they come out of the water like amphibians.
That's season 2 world.
I mean,
the question is, how long do we have to give NA before they
emerge?
Fully, yeah.
We're like 50% out of the water right now. We got to get to a semis again. All right, so Gigabyte Marines, pretty impressive for an emerging region. And you're saying that you expect more teams to be on that level pretty much every international tournament from now on, that they'll be kind of an emerging region team that pushes everyone else a little bit.
Sure. I think that's a fair expectation from now on, yeah.
All right. We're going to switch topics up now. Kind of. Still pretty similar. Kelsey, you wanted to talk about TSM's drafts a little bit, right?
Yeah, so there was a lot of frustration with the TSM drafting situation. We talked a little bit about the performance of the team, the fact that they didn't seem to understand a lot of basic map movement stuff, but people really, really tunnel visioned on a few things from draft that seemed really obvious. I think the first thing that people brought up was when they started playing the hyper carry, AD carries with the supportive mid. So that was one thing that people complained about with TSM's draft, because they decided it completely misunderstood like what TSM were good at. Another thing that people thought was really bad was when they played against Gigabyte Marines, they would fail to ban Gragas after playing them several times, and they would fail to ban Ziggs sometimes, things like this. And then in the final match, like people, the thing that kind of, I think the straw that broke the camel's back on people looking at the matchups on the final match, the tiebreaker match, was they had a lot of bad lane matchups that game. And then also in addition, they banned 2 champions that Betty basically never plays ever, and just gave him the champion that he will always pick, right? The Ashe. Like he'll always pick that if that's up. So I think that those were the main points that I saw over and over again about TSM's draft. So I wanted to ask, like, how bad was the draft really? Was it something that we can say cost them the tournament in some ways?
So I have Oh, you want to go, Emily?
No.
Okay. So I have the opinion that, yes, the drafts were bad, but I didn't think it was an issue with decision-making during pick ban. There are obvious instances where it was dumb. Like those bans, you can say, like, those were bad bans. You shouldn't be banning those things against them. But I thought that they just struggled more in the tournament meta due to, like, player limitations and team limitations. So Syndra, strongest mage champion that everyone's playing in mid lane. The most two common counters for it are Fizz and Echo, and Bjergsen doesn't play either of them. They play Jace every time that the other team gets the Syndra. I think they played Ori a couple times, but for the most part, they're playing the Jace into it, which makes their team comps really weird. And then we talk about the Protect the Turtle comp being bad for TSM, but it was one of the strongest comps the entire competition, the entire tournament so far, that like you run 2 shields and a Caitlyn or something and you become a monster team late game. And so like that's not a bad draft. It's like you can't play that with Turtle. And then you can't early take Fizz and flex it because Bjergsen doesn't play it. So you end up in a lot of situations where you're really like handicapped by what your players can do. And that's not like, oh man, during pick ban, Par should have just done this thing. And that's where I felt like a lot of people were off base with the draft. Even if the criticism was like the right amount for the drafts, I didn't feel like it was right to be like, what is Par doing? I'm like, why can't you flex Fizz? Why is your team incapable of playing with Fizz mid lane when like Optimus is doing it and Faker's doing it and like everyone's doing it? That's where I had a problem.
I will say I was. Oh, go.
No, I was just going to say that it's like I think the Ori pick is fine. In general, I think they were too afraid to early pick solo lanes in general. So that would be one concern that I had with them, is just like you can blind Ori in a lot of situations, for example, and they just like avoided doing that a lot. So I think that there are a few situations where draft priority or understanding of draft where you're always picking your solo lane, your duo lane champions like early on in the draft was a little bit outdated. So like that draft philosophy I had a few issues with. So like the philosophy of the draft rather than specific picks for me were more of a problem. And that's why like I am more critical of the draft, I guess, than other people would be. But I don't think by any means that it was like their biggest problem. And the one criticism that really was weird to me was like the hyper carry ADC supportive mid thing. Like, I think that's fine. So, especially if your supportive mid is Orianna. But
yeah, I mean, that one still has enough like damage and playmaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, so I was one of the biggest critics when teams weren't banning Gragas, and this was not just TSM, actually. It was a few teams. And the reason why I'm super critical of that is because I see this all the time, especially at international events, but even sometimes in domestic leagues. Like this will even happen in Korea, where like a team is like, no, this team is like so much, like we know we can beat them, and it doesn't really matter what what they play, I feel is the mindset that goes through there. And it's like, if you know that this team, even if you are better than them, has this special, like, specific pick, and they don't usually lose with it, and it's the only thing that their top laner has played at any sort of, like, comparative level, then maybe you should just ban it.
It's like the Ziggs
maybe
pick.
that is more valuable, in my opinion, in a draft. It is more valuable to ban that than ban, like, an OP, because as we then saw, like, with certain OPs, like the Galio, for example, like, they had one really great game that I liked where they were combining the Galio ult with the Zed.
Yep.
That I thought was really cool. But like other than that one game, and even in that game, like laning, not so great. Like Stark obviously just picked up the champion. Like, I mean, it's not difficult to see that. And so I feel like if you, like this happens at international events all the time, it always annoys me. If you know that a team, you played this team before, you know that they picked this, just ban it. Even if you think you're better than them, you know what? It's security. Just do it. Like, I'm so sick of teams doing this, honestly. Like, I know this is turning into a rant, but I see it all the time.
I mean,
other than that, though, like, I will say, I think it's unfair to, and I think it's not attacking, because we talked about TSM, right, already? And I'm sure we'll talk more about them on the show. But, like, TSM made a lot of mistakes, like execution mistakes that should be addressed before blaming the draft for not making it into the knockout stage. Like, I don't think criticizing the draft shouldn't lead to people saying, oh, draft was the thing that like ultimately made the difference between making it out and not making it out, because I actually don't think that's true. I think TSM executes better on some of these drafts that they did have, and they win.
Right. I would say, like, you look at that Jace pick that I was saying I didn't really like into Syndra. They still, against G2, I think it was, had that huge lead, like 6-7K. They have Baron and Elder, and they can't break an inhib turret. That's not like, oh, man, their draft really let them down this game. It's like, you should win from that position. If you're not winning from that position, your team is bad at macro or something. There's issues beyond the draft.
Yeah. That's where it really, like, that's where criticizing the draft bothers me. Like, I think it's fine to criticize the draft because I think, like, there are some head scratchers there, like, again, the Grogasigs or the banning Twitch and Kog'Maw against Betty. I don't think Betty has played Kog'Maw once, and I think he's played Twitch once in this tournament and he lost. So that was kind of like, okay, a little weird. But I don't think, and honestly, like, it's really rare, even though draft is kind of the easiest thing to look at, it's really rare that I've seen a team, like, not advance because of drafting only. Like, I actually can't think off the top of my head of a situation where I've ever seen a team, like, you can clearly define, like, this team did not make it because their drafts were terrible. I don't know if you guys can think of one. Yeah,
it's a little hard to think off the top of my head. There's definitely been, like, times where you're like, what is this team doing? They're just, like, kind of playing their own game, but that's often almost more of like did they misread the meta than it is like, oh, they keep getting out drafted super hard, they don't know how, like, oh, they don't know these matchups or something. I always felt most of the time that I have big issues with how the drafts were playing out. It was more like understanding the meta properly, which can happen at tournaments when you're on a new patch and you have like 2 weeks to get ready and you're not scrimming the top, like all the top teams consistently.
And I guess some things, it's like when you do things like you draft bad matchups in every lane, right? It's really hard to play with that most of the time.
So you're talking more about like a Flash Wolves last game because they didn't really have any playmaking and priority anywhere.
Yeah, so that kind of situation, yeah, I can see where you would fall super hard on the draft, but I think that they managed to actually kind of pull it out in some situations, so I think it was okay, and you can't really blame the draft completely for that game. I mean, Turtle had some interesting moments in that particular game, in particular if we want to look at things like the way that his build order was really weird with, I think he went like a tier into Triforce and didn't build Blade of the Ruined King until super late or something on his raid. I don't know. There are a lot of different flaws, I guess is the point, but you do make it really hard for yourself if you pick like 2 losing solo lane matchups and a less aggressive jungle pick, like Graves, for example. So I do think you kind of put yourself in a hole when you do that. But a lot of people could see the philosophy behind that. Like, I talked to someone else who had an interesting take on that, which is that Flash Wolves are even worse. Like, that TSM were trying to use the G2 strategy, and Flash Wolves are even worse than TSM at understanding what to do when you get past the 40-minute mark. So, like, TSM adopted double tier, super scaling. Like, we'll just be able to out-team fight them and this type of crutch strategy. So, yeah.
In fairness, that's not like a bad bet in this tournament.
There was one Dragon team fight where like Biofrost got walled off by Taliyah. That was a team fight where like they blew a lot on Sven, and if you just had like that extra Karma shield, they probably turned that team fight because it was like such a flubbed kind of engage on the side of Flash Wolf. So I think like if you're saying, yeah, we're TSM, we'll take a bunch of shields and then come late game we'll out team fight you, I can kind of see the philosophy behind that, but it also doesn't really play to their strengths where it's like we're supposed to have 2 really good laners. As much as we said Haunter underperformed, he actually had some of the better laning stats over the course of the tournament. So like you could say hypothetically, you know, Bjergsen on Syndra and stuff like that, but then it felt like he stopped getting Syndra and had to play these like more losing matchups. Because he didn't have an answer for Taliyah, and they played Ryze into it twice, which felt awful.
Rise all around,
Just
like,
play
and
an
Bjergsen's
assassin.
Rise
Come on,
is
guys.
usually good, but like, I did not like Rise at this tournament at all.
Yeah, I felt like it took way too long to
I
turn
know
online.
we said we weren't gonna harp on drafts, but like, good God, stop picking mid lane.
Well, this is more the problem that we were saying, right? Was like, is the problem like, oh man,
Meta.
yeah, did they understand their drafts properly and they just took horrible losing lanes, or was it like, did they have anything that they wanted to play in Taliyah now that, like, you know, Victor's dead and a lot of the things that Bjergsen was always known for being really good on, it's basically like Ori, Syndra are the two things that we really recognize Bjergsen for, and then like after that he's playing a little bit of Taliyah. He's playing Jace. He's playing a lot of weird stuff because he's not playing the Fizz or the Echo that a lot of other mid laners were playing.
Were either of you surprised at the lack of Ahri priority?
No.
Like, not that she'd be like super high, but
I mean, there are more opportunities to take her into Oriana's because Oriana was a pretty high priority pick. So I was a little surprised at that part, but it felt like a lot of teams just don't think she's super useful beyond like that laning matchup. And once you get out of it, and Ori is just going to become way more useful in team fights. And given how late a lot of the games were going, it is a little understandable.
Like, Ahri's damage just isn't competitive enough, I think, for it to be super high priority. So I was fine with there not being a lot of Ahri priority. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I don't think any of us are saying Bjergsen can't play, because some people in chat are asking about this. We're not saying Bjergsen can't play Fizz or he can't play Echo. We've seen him play those champions before. It's for whatever reason, TSM was not picking them. So whether
I was just going to say, when you usually say like mid laner can't play like this champion, it actually doesn't mean that they can't play it solo. It just means that the team, for whatever reason, doesn't feel comfortable with them on that champion. Like, it's usually like 99% of the time when you talk to teams, it's a team thing. It's like, oh, you saw a lot with Aurelion Sol, actually, when Aurelion Sol was really popular. And you'd have mid laners being like, we have to ban it because I don't feel comfortable playing it. And that's not like, I can't play Aurelion Sol. It's, I don't feel comfortable running an Aurelion Sol composition with my team.
Right.
So I'd imagine it's a similar thing with Fizz and Echo.
Yeah, it's like, okay, Bjergsen on non-wave clear mids, our team sucks. We struggle with that.
Yeah.
We need Bjergsen with some wave clear. I mean, that sounds pretty believable to me. I don't know how you guys believe that.
I agree.
All right, we're going to change things up now to expand a little bit more on the rest of the group stage. We've been talking a lot about TSM and Gigabyte Marines. The next topic up is what the F happened at MSI and why was the group stage so insane and everyone looked terrible? Because I think there's a lot of different angles you can take on this. You could say maybe people weren't prepared for the meta that developed. They didn't practice much Galio or something, which became strong. And then there were a lot of different fighters in the top lane that people were playing. You have Kennons, you have Fizzes, all this different stuff. Maybe it's because people were nervous. International, everyone's just playing worse. Maybe it's harder to play right now for some reason. I want to get your guys' takes on why the level of competition seemed to be so low, with basically everyone except SKT clearly being like SKT. That's how they'd look. And then maybe World Elite, you say, looked like a world-class team, but it wasn't like a super dominant team from a region. It was like maybe a 2 or 3 seed, and everyone else looked like, what? This is the best team from that region? Are they a major region? Like, none of the other teams look like that.
I think it was less surprising to me that we had a lot of back and forth games, because most of the teams that came to this tournament, even though they were first in their region, we didn't have a lot of lane kingdom teams, which, by the way, original attribution of that doesn't go to perks, it goes to Forgiven. Okay, that was originally a Forgiven meme.
That whole thing, anyways.
People will now. But anyway, the point is, there weren't a lot of early game or lane kingdom focused teams that just like really would go like secure a snowball, keep the momentum of this composition, like 1-3-1, maintain side lanes well. Like, there was just a lot of not 1-3-1 oriented teams at this tournament. There were a lot of teams that like to play conservative early. Like, the way that I would explain it is that they were jungle mid focused teams that went to this tournament. And when people think of jungle mid focused teams, oh my God, we're going to have insane 2v2s at level 1. But no, it's more like the mid laner pushes out the jungle, invades, and lays down vision, and like these types of things. But it was not executed super well or super consistently. Like there was a lot of inconsistency in laying down wards and coming back to back it up and things like this, because a lot of these teams got to this tournament just by understanding mid-games rotations a little bit better. But the overall understanding of those types of things, I think, is relatively low internationally. So to me, this tournament wasn't that surprising. Like, I expected a lot of back and forth games. I was actually kind of surprised that there weren't more.
Weren't more?
Yeah. If you look at the data statistically, the amount of comebacks after 20 minutes were actually pretty low. Overall. So I kind of, for me, it was not that surprising that we saw a lot of weird wishy-washy games where there was like teams that were relying on their jungler to invade, but didn't necessarily know how to play to pressure as well, or didn't necessarily know how to use mid priority as well. It's just like, because they have slightly better understanding of this than, like, even just looking at G2, right? I would say G2's understanding of side lane control mid to late game is the best in their region. But if you look at the second best team in the EULCS is Unicorns of Love, and I don't know if those guys have ever seen a side lane in their life. Like, they just
that's where you go after a fight.
They constantly 5-man mid. Like, they will pick tank top laners and they'll lay down vision in the top red side jungle, and that's like what they do. And they go and they fight, and it's telling that most of the comebacks were red side comebacks because they would just fight in that top red side jungle over wards, and like you have more priority of that and stuff like this. So to me, yeah, it wasn't that shocking that we had a lot of games like this. Maybe it was shocking to me that TSM did as well as they did.
Well, yeah, so that's what's weird for me. It was like, I was like, okay, TSM, they didn't look good in their own region. They had a really close, sloppy best of 5 versus C9 after not looking super great overall. I expect them to struggle, and then they did. But the surprising thing was, like, G2 was struggling pretty hard. And, I mean, Flash Wolves, this team that we all hyped up as kind of like the number 2 cleared team coming into this event, didn't turn out that way at all. They barely made it through. You could say, like, TSM, even though they just lost their number 1 pool thing for Worlds, that they really were about basically the same level as G2 and Flash Wolves. They were definitely worse, but not to the degree that it's like, yeah, get them out of there. They shouldn't be in bracket at all. I feel like the matchups were relatively close.
Flash was really surprised and disappointed me, I guess. It's not that I thought they were going to be like, oh man, they're definitely going to contend for first because they have this good matchup against SKT and stuff like that. But I was surprised at the lack of understanding they had around their own success, if that makes sense. Like, I felt like they suddenly got to this tournament and felt like they had to, and I received this impression from talking to them and also from watching their games. Like, I feel like they came here and they were like, oh, we need to switch up our play style in order to be able to compete. And I don't think they had to do that. Like, we talked about the Rise, the scaling picks for Maple, like, don't stop. Like, you notice, like, the difference when he was finally on, like, even the Syndra, for example. Like, it was
Syndra
just
is his champion, but yeah.
Yeah. But they weren't picking it for him, so it was kind of like, okay. Yeah. Even when she was up, like, it really confused me. Like, I was kind of stunned at their inability to understand their own success, I guess. Like, I don't even think it's something where you can point to, like, I do think you point to LMS and you're like, oh man, once this team gets to the top of their region, like, the rest of the region is like whatever. But you could say the same thing for NA, even with all the parity that there was in NA this past year. Like, we talked about the teams that, like, if this were a Worlds tournament, the 2 and 3 seeds, like, would have been a little shaky. So I don't know, like, that really bothered me. I felt like a lot of, and this is going to tie into what we're going to talk about next, but, like, I felt like a lot of teams came here and then they were suddenly like, oh, we need to play these like scaling shield comps because that is what's done. And I just don't like throwing out an entire strategy for the sake of meta when it's the thing that works the best for your team.
I can understand that, but even like beyond throwing out the meta stuff, people are playing styles that aren't great for them. There's like a lot of fundamental problems with how teams were playing the game, right? Like we talked about Sideways not being great. Oh, yeah. Most teams had very suspect Barons. Like the freest Barons that people got were usually off the back of the other team, like just vacating the area or at the end of a team fight. There was hardly ever like we baited the Baron. They came in once, we cleared their blue trinkets, we rebaited again, we hit the Ash Arrow, and then we pick, and then we like there was almost none of that, and that's really what surprised me, because I feel like at Worlds, unless it's like, you know, the 3rd seed versus the 3rd seed somewhere else, like for the most part at Worlds, you see a lot of kind of play like that. When one team gets a lead, it's a lot of very controlled play, and the only person who really felt like they were playing controlled was SKT, and then that points WE. And I was just surprised that the rest of the world seemed to be struggling so much around Baron. And like even inhibitors and stuff like that.
I mean, we've seen so even in like Korea, like not as much. It's not as prevalent, but like the lower teams, like we've seen so many 50-50 Barons.
Do you think
split?
Do you think if like, SKT like just didn't come, do you think you would have seen the same kind of level of play out of KT or Samsung if they made it? As the rest of the world, and they would be clearly worse than SKT?
I think KT has, if they go in with like how they played throughout this split, I think they hammer you early. Like to the point where even though I say their mid game is like kind of suspect at times.
Yeah, they threw a lot.
But like they will hammer you early. And I don't see, and it's not through the same thing where you have the, I mean, Pawn kind of just does what he wants. It's not like, they're not like relying on Pawn necessarily to always be like pushing. It's not the same mid jungle that Kelsey talked about with a lot of these other teams. And you have very, very strong laners, and that's kind of what they draft to, and they learn to draft to their strengths. So even though I have shat on KT all split, I think they would perform at a high level. And I also think Samsung would probably perform at a similarly high level as well, although you would have to worry a little bit about how they deal with Ruler's champion pool, since it was very easily dealt with by SKT. Like I thought they had a very good strategy for going up against Samsung. And then Haru has been phenomenal this past split, but at the same time, I do feel like you can exploit his playstyle with proper wording. So if teams learned to do that, I think that Samsung might not be as dominant, but I don't know. I think you'd see the same level of dominance from those teams. After that, it gets really dicey with Afrika and MVP, because they have shown that they don't understand a lot of those things as well. So
yeah, but I feel like by the time you get to the 4th seed at most regions, it's like, I don't want to send FlyQuest.
Yeah, it's kind of like, okay. At least MVP, like MVP and Afrika actually, like they've both done really interesting things this split that some of which we've even talked about on the show. So it's at least they'd be fun to watch, although it wouldn't necessarily be good. So, you know, I would be curious to see actually like how they do in that weird hypothetical wonderland that is, if a team went to this tournament, how would they perform? But I don't know, like, I guess my question I would throw back to you guys is, do you think there's a team from these other major regions, like putting WE aside, because I think WE is kind of, maybe Kelsey can talk more about them, but I think they did show like they basically only got better, in my opinion, as the tournament went on. But can you think of other teams from these major regions? Like, so if such and such team had made it out of NA, if such and such team made it out of Europe, like they would have performed so much better? Because I honestly can't think of one for North America or Europe that I can say confidently would have been like, oh yeah, they would have come here and they would have, you know, they would have performed so much better than G2. They would have performed so much better than TSM. Like,
again, for me, the thing that's letting us down is like this idea of lane assignments, right? And like after a certain point, just even in the early game, sometimes lane assignments, in general, letting people down. And the one team that we kind of praised in NA before all the roster disaster happened for having some kind of a better understanding of like 131s and putting pressure in lanes was P1. So that might be the one team that I could consider going to. But I think all throughout NA, there was just this really weird fixation on 5v5ing all the time, like mid instead of going.
Yep.
So for me, NA, no, maybe P1. I already explained EU was that situation. I think you could almost argue Fnatic's playoffs form, but with them, it was like they didn't understand Baron setups at all, and they often sent their jungler bottom to try to flank like in the 1-4s in situations like this. So at inopportune moments, so I don't think they necessarily would have done better either. So for me, it's just. Yeah, I do think there's just an overall feeling that there is a huge, like, I think China strategically has done much better this split than they have in years. And part of that was RNG and the way that they approached the game in terms of, like, setting up side lanes and things like this that other teams learned from. EDG having to rely more on mid-game rotations now that they downgraded their roster, things like this. So China actually caught up a little bit in strategy, but I feel like everyone else kind of just like hung out and regressed a bit. But
yeah, for NA, I'd probably throw C9 in there just for like you could say meta-wise, I think they would do better at the tournament just because, you know, they were comfortable with Jensen playing Fizz, Echo, and then if you're playing a protect comp, protecting Sneaky sounds a lot better than protecting Turtle, but they had that same issue where like they have the Echo and instead of generating pressure and like TPing or things like that or moving over to the Echo, they just group mid with it. So they didn't play any better in the mid late game. You would just say maybe their champ pools and how the team functions would be a little bit better in the meta, but that's it. And other than that, before just to end on this topic, do you think that there's any like we saw Monty kind of tweet that, oh, all this like money's getting thrown around and the teams look like this, they all look worse, and like that's kind of true for NA and EU, but it was also true for Flash Wolves. It was kind of true. Well, I guess Flash Wolves, this is a little bit the level that we saw at Worlds last year as well, where they didn't make it out. And then I think you can say
that was even worse.
Yeah. So I guess in that regard, do you think it's like fair to be like, oh, they're throwing all these resources around, but they're not getting any better? Or is it just kind of a weird symptom of this event in particular?
I mean, do you want to like, okay, this is going to sound really mean, but like, do you want to get better? Like, I guess this is like me being a heinous bitch and calling out all the NA teams, but like,
damn,
do you
Emily
want
dropping bombs this episode?
I know.
Take cover.
Like, that's always something. No, that's something I wonder in my head though. With like how good do you want to be? Like, do you actually want to improve, or do you want to make sure you're in for franchising next year, or like make money? Like, I'm not even throwing shade. Like, I don't know, like making money is cool. Like, you can do it if you want. Like, I won't judge you for that. But like,
cue the bling effects.
Like, just money is
cool.
You drop the glasses on her.
Yeah, the G2 video. Everyone knows the G2 video.
Oh, yeah.
It's like good shit.
Riaz on my purse and just start sprinkling them everywhere. Like in all seriousness, like I'm never gonna be like, oh man, your business, like how dare you make money, because that's just stupid. I think that is a question that like maybe fans want to ask. Like, do you, or even ask yourself, like, are you okay with just being a fan of TSM and watching them win? Like NALCS, are you okay with like watching C9 do well in NALCS? Like, is that okay for you as long as you don't make international events? And as for improving, like, I honestly don't know the answer. It's so many like small things. If I had to make one request, I mean, it would be like scouting better would probably be like my first instinct to like my one piece of advice to teams that I would give is just be like scouting better. And by that, I don't mean like looking at them mechanically, but like, how are they going to fit in a team? If you're importing a player, like, are they outgoing? Are they gregarious? Do they want to be here? Why do they want to be here? And like, are they coachable, or do they have a record of already like pushing back? I mean, I think there just has to be a better job done in that. And we're getting on like kind of a tangent, but I don't know how NA gets better. But if you want NA to get better, maybe demand more from your teams.
Sounds pretty fair to me. And with that rant, I think we're going to wrap up this topic. We're going to go to a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about MSI, but in a more abstract sense about preparing for your opponents versus yourself and how to tell how a team's going to do based off what you see out of their regional strengths. So we'll take a quick commercial break and then continue on with those topics.
Hey guys, Avaline with Yahoo Esports, and I'm at the Phoenix One House with Inori. You're going to be my tour guide for today?
Yep.
Sweet. And I noticed this sign right here. It says, keep the doors closed, otherwise the cat will run outside. So there's a cat here?
It's somewhere. His name is Rangar, and he likes to hide in
Rangar?
bushes.
Hey everyone, I'm here at the Phoenix One House. I'm going to get a tour from Inori. How's it going, Inori?
Not bad, not bad.
All right, is the house sick?
I'm not sure what other houses you've been to, but for my standards, I think it's pretty sick.
Okay, cool. Well, that's very good. I have my Travis cam here so we can get some close-up shots of stuff. I can already tell there's going to be a cat here because of the sign. You guys got the cat. We've referenced this previously.
It was mostly for Ryu, but now it's kind of just the team cat, so everyone's been taking care of it a bit.
We'll find out when we can find the cat. Oh, there's an alarm going off. Things are already going terribly.
Somebody's breaking in.
Well, let's take a look at these shoes. These are like the really expensive ones, right? Like I don't know much about shoes. I'm not a sneakerhead, but this is like a thing, right?
Some of the players they like shoes. I'm not that big on it. I just wear Vans and.
What is this?
What?
This little creature thing.
Oh, like, these are arrows.
Oh.
Slippers. Yeah.
Okay, that's definitely unique.
Yeah, he's a funny taste.
Okay, take a look over here.
Yeah, here's the best part.
Okay, and that's the cat.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's just wake him up.
So we could just stop now that we have seen the cat. That's pretty much the most exciting part of the tour.
Yeah.
The cat is not happy about being woken up.
It's okay.
Are you bringing the cat on the rest of the tour?
For now.
Welcome back, everybody. As unfortunate as it is, there's no cats on this show. I wish there was, just walking across the desk. Not the case. We're going to continue on talking a little bit about MSI, but this time, like I said, a little bit more abstract of a topic. Emily, you brought this one about preparing yourself versus opponents.
Yes. So one thing, like I did a ton of interviews this past week with teams and players. And one thing that kept coming up that like kind of bothered me a bit was this idea that a lot of players across like multiple teams, this isn't just one team, it's actually almost all teams I talked to outside of the Marines. And they basically said like, oh, you know, we came in and we really had to adapt to this meta because scaling ADs with shield comps are just so strong and we weren't prepared for that. And I wanted to talk about, because this is something that we see a lot in international events where teams will like over prepare for opponents and feel like they have to adjust to a specific meta instead of really taking a look at what works well for them as a team and then trying to find their own place in the current meta with like the players they have, with the champions they can play. And it ties into a lot of what we were talking about before. But it's something that I see at international events a lot. And that's why I kept saying throughout the weekend that I wish more teams would learn from the Marines' attitude, because whenever I ask them about like specific champion picks or like why they did something, they just be like, oh yeah, like, so we practiced this and we found out it works really well for our team, or like we practiced, you know, we did end up practicing that, but it didn't work out as well for us. And I know that obviously there's some leeway that needs to happen and some improvement, like basic improvement that needs to happen with the Marines specifically, especially thinking of their mid game and like the weird lane swap and understanding just basic like wave control and stuff like that. But I'm so tired of seeing teams come to international events and feel like they have to adjust to this like meta in their heads and forget what works really well for them as a team. So.
Talking about TSM, because I think that's the one that a lot of people think about, and obviously I'm an NA fan. It's weird because on the one hand, yeah, you can't copy the meta. If the meta becomes, we're going to run shield comps, protect the AD, and you're against Fen versus Turtle when you're like talking about late game, who's going to outperform, unless you're talking about like, oh, well, Hanser will set us up better with his tank engages and stuff like that. A lot of the times you're like, okay, this strategy is just worse for us because their team has better players for it. But there's other times as well where you're talking about the Gigabyte Marines being this crazy ass team in the early game. And the first time that TSM played them in the group stage, they had like a shield protect comp that just kind of went off the rails. And obviously it's around Turtle, so everyone's like, oh, why would you build this way? But then another team ran that same comp against Gigabyte Marines, and it worked great because as long as you don't die, you're running a lot of protection stuff, and then you just outscale. So like, I can kind of see both sides of the argument where against a specific team, if they have this one style and you can draft a certain way to really shut down what they want to do, for the most part, in theory, I kind of like that actually. I like that even though it doesn't work super to TSM strengths, and I wouldn't want them to play the meta against G2, they can play the meta against Gigabyte Marines, if this makes sense to you guys, what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I personally think that there's like an ideal way to play the game, and then each team has like an ideal way to play the game for them. So it's about finding the convergence between the two. I think in general you should strive to play the meta. Like you should really strive to play the meta. And the problem isn't necessarily in that you're unable to play the meta, it's that you didn't prepare enough to know that this would be the meta going in, so you haven't practiced it. And I think that's the bigger issue. What we're looking at is that like they haven't really prepared for the type of style that people are bringing out or the type of compositions that people are drafting and finding a lot of success with. So they're trying to adapt like really, really quickly, and just the holes in it are showing through. So I think the more ideal, the question that's really being asked here is like, what do you do in situations where you're caught off guard by a meta change? Do you suddenly like really try to hammer home and adapt, or do you stick with like what has been working for you?
I think it's tough because you can see like when they ran Kennen into Galio and he starts getting solo killed, and I was talking with Skara about it, and we were both like, how exactly does this matchup play out? We haven't really seen it much. And, you know, Triple Doran's Galio gets pretty dumb and can like insta-clear the wave, and Kennen might not have enough time to harass, or he might not have enough sustain to deal with the harass coming out of Galio. And you end up in a lot of situations where it's like, do the pros even know? Have they scrimmed this enough times against a competent enough opponent to really nail down the matchup? Have they ran 1v1s like multiple times? And maybe you end up in matchups that you haven't practiced enough. And it makes it look like you didn't understand. Well, I guess that is not understanding the meta. You haven't practiced that stuff enough. But I would say generally, I agree with a lot of what Emily said about less about champions and more about like mentality and being who you want to be. So if G2 wants to be this like super late game team that's going to go late all the time and draft around that and play around that, I think that's actually fine as long as they nail down their early game plan and Trick stops being the worst jungler at the event. Like I think the plan is fine. The player may not be doing the plan correctly.
Yeah. I mean, because it just really, and like, I guess I found it more with Flash Wolves specifically, but kind of from all teams. But Flash Wolves were the one where I really like, they kept saying like, oh man, like we don't know what to do with like scaling ADs. We have to play them because it's the meta. And I just felt like they could have easily, and like, this is what they did towards the latter half of the tournament, like made sure that Maple got champions where he could control the game, and made sure Betty was on a champion that he was comfortable with, instead of, you know, making him play Twitch, which, you know, didn't work out so well. I guess I also, for the mid-season invitational specifically, I feel like there might always be this kind of weird push and pull between what I'm good at versus the meta because there's less time to prepare. And there's also fewer scrim partners, which is kind of a weird, unique situation that probably only happens at this tournament because you do only have 6 teams in the group stage itself.
I mean, to that end, you could say that Gigabyte Marines were able to get like a lot more practice just because they got there so much earlier. And sure, they might not be scrimming SKT, but at least they're playing on that patch against people who are also playing on that patch and need to take it seriously. Whereas like if TSM is waiting to fly in, no one's either scrimming, or if they are, they don't want to play on this like weird patch when they're going to be playing on the most recent one, and that's what they want to practice on.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. And then, China came over like the week of pretty much because of when their final was.
Yeah,
so.
they may as well have just played their finals in Brazil.
The WE thing really is just like why I was so lukewarm on WE in general is that I don't think in general they understand what they're good at. Like they'll have these really good high level games and then they won't be able to replicate them because it's like they don't understand how they got the high level game in the first place. So, yeah. I mean,
so for them, it's not about preparing for their opponents or preparing for themselves. It's about understanding how they get wins in their first place.
It is to an extent because I do think if you're WE, you have to understand your lane matchups really well and have to have the correct lane matchups for the situation, for the path that Condi wants to do. But yeah, it's one of those where I don't think for them preparation was as big of an issue, and you saw them kind of just like adjust slowly anyway, so I think they were fine.
Yeah, they were the only team that I interviewed who kept repeatedly saying like, no, we'll figure it out. It's an us thing, not a... Because like a lot of other players I talked to, they were like, oh yeah, we need to adjust. Like we need to adjust. We're so caught off guard, like, or we don't know how to do this, and we need to figure out a way to make sure we can compete. And every time I talk to anyone from WE, they're always like, nope, it's us. We'll handle it. We're getting better. We're learning to we're relearning to trust each other. I was just like, okay.
How much of that is like a confidence and mindset thing though? Whereas like other teams are panicking like, oh God, what do we do? We need to scrim more. We need to figure this out. And WE's like, we'll sit back. We'll think about it. We'll figure out what works for us and then we'll move forward.
I mean, I think it's a good attitude. Like to my point for introducing this, like I think they have the right attitude, right? Like when they do feel like they're caught off guard or when they do feel like they're behind, they look at themselves first. And I guess like that's kind of where I'm going with this. Like if you find that your team is struggling with something, look at your team first instead of like what other teams are doing, and then then look at what other teams are doing and you'll be able to understand it better. I don't know. I just feel like teams could benefit a lot more from having that kind of attitude where it's like, no, it's us. Like, let's figure this out as a team.
All right, well, I got to push us ahead here. We have a couple more topics, about an hour, 45 minutes left. So we're going to move on to Kelsey's next topic about 5 ways to determine team strength, the clickbait title.
It's like how to improve yourself.
Yeah.
So this goes back to like for example, watching these games, I felt like something that was continuously setting teams behind or the teams were failing on was just like the lane assignments, being able to pressure multiple lanes at once, like reacting to these types of plays, overgrouping, like these types of scenarios. So is there something that we can identify that really sort of separated the best play or the best games that we saw from the not so good play? And if so, are these things that we can identify more broadly when we look at teams when they're playing in their own regions in isolation and things like this going forward?
I think for mid game, we should be better at identifying those kinds of things. I think early game is one that's super hard to nail down. It's like Flash Wolves, obviously. The big reason people were hyping them up a lot was that they had such a nasty early game in their own region. And then you come here, and I think they were like the second worst early game team. They were down 800 gold on average at 15 minutes or something. So I think early game advantages, if you're not very careful about how they're getting them, if it's like through any sort of laning, you can't necessarily guarantee that they'll hold up. And that's always really hard because it's like this thing where it's like, okay, because we're winning this lane, I can move around the map better. And once I move around the map, then I look really good. But if you don't get those laning advantages first, this team falls apart, which I think has been the case sometimes with a team like TSM. And then mid game, though, you would think that if a team looks like they really know how to move around the map, that should translate pretty well to international play. And for TSM, I didn't think they were good at it. And then lo and behold, they're not. But maybe some of the other teams, it felt more like they should be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Kelsey touched upon this, but I don't know if this is on your like 5 ways, but I think side lane pressure and understanding of lane assignments, as in like who should be in what lane doing what thing, is something that like I'm personally just looking at games, trying to understand better. Because I think it's something that a lot of teams can improve on, and recognizing like where things go wrong in those circumstances is something that might point to, because like, for example, we look at TSM in North America, and they came to MSI because they had the best understanding of how to create split pressure in the mid game. But does that necessarily mean that they're good at that? And the answer is obviously no, especially if they're also not paying attention to where their waves are pushing like early to mid, and Svenskeren is still trying to invade his opponent's jungle. Which again is something we saw domestically, but it definitely he improved to the point where like TSM had it down and he wasn't dying as much early, right, by the end of the split and then going into playoffs. And now they come to the international stage and that all falls apart and he looks really, really bad. And so I think that's definitely something that, like, for me personally, I'm going to be looking out for a lot more, is just lane assignments and where lanes are pushing when.
I think for, like, at least for top laners, it can be a little difficult because it does kind of get back into that how big of a lead did they get early question, because and this is why for League a lot of the time it is kind of hard to tell. It's so dependent on the other team. So if you have a good top laner who in your own region gets ahead and then can split pressure, and the other team does not react well, where they devote extra resources to shutting him down. I forget which team that happened to, where they had an early lead. I think it was TSM actually, where they had an early lead on the Fizz. He was like 2 kills, and then he died a couple times in side lanes because the other team kept sending a Talia down or something to cut him off. And that's a situation where, like, if this team truly understood split push pressure, they would have had like vision, and their team would have been doing other stuff. But the times that it happened, TSM's just dicking around mid lane doing nothing. So it is that kind of situation where in their own region, it really does look like they understand how to split push pressure. But then as soon as the competition also understands it better, they seem to fall behind.
A lot of it is also just like when we're identifying this stuff, looking at the champion matchups, like I think one thing that was really interesting is that when you had Malzahar, it was really hard to defend or contest bot side river vision. And this was something we saw continuously throughout MSIs. Like if the enemy team picked Malzahar, you might have Karma, and you go and you get caught, and there was a lot of games that snowballed from that conjunction. So whereas like maybe if you have, like I remember seeing games in LCS or other regions where it would just be okay to go into the river with Karma. So just thinking about more about those types of like small situations in terms of lane assignments with champion specifics, like the way that people use Hawkshot was also another interesting thing. So just like more and more critical thinking about like whether or not this would be okay normally, I think is another issue. I don't think that like TSM, again, it seemed like they didn't necessarily have, like whenever they had a 1-3-1 comp, they struggled a lot, right? There was the entire meme, like it got better over time. There was the entire meme where TSM can't play if they don't have a tank, right? That was very persistent for a while. But that was just, again, because like they didn't know lane setups and how to 1-3-1. They didn't necessarily always bounce the wave correctly when they did go bottom. Like these types of scenarios, I think, are, for me, were red flags for TSM, but they should have been red flags for G2 a bit more as well. It's just that, like, the gap between, I think, G2 and most of the other EU teams was just really large in terms of that particular aspect. So
I also think it's important, like, piggybacking on that, just something that Mark said that reminded me, it's Haunter, how Haunter got his leads. Because, like, I think another thing that's really important when you look at things domestically is, and again, something I've been really trying to challenge myself to pay more attention to, is how individual solo laners, especially if you are relying on those solo laners to split push or create pressure elsewhere come mid-game, how they're getting their leads. Because, like, I don't know what it was about Haunter this past split, but there were times where any teams would just execute these, like, awful dives on the top turret, and he would just turn it around and get 2 kills. And, like, credit to him for being able to turn it around, but it's also, like, I just remember one specific moment with Chaser that was just so bad. And it's like, why are you just, like, you're just, like, handing him gold so he can, like, destroy you later on. And another thing to point out is kind of the same thing with, like, G2 and Trick. I think Trick gets away with a lot in the early game because he just kind of sits back and farms. And he's not challenged a lot in his own region. But here, obviously, like, and I think it's a combination of the fact that he was challenged and also he just seemed to be performing very poorly. But, like, they didn't let him get away with that, right? Like, he's not just going to be able to sit back and farm the jungle and then join up and be this, like, super strong carry anymore. He's going to get challenged. He's going to have buff contests. He's going to have camps contested. And he seemed very lost when that happened. So I think that's something else I really want to pay attention to going forward, is, like, how specific players get, like, especially early leads in either lanes or the jungle.
So just to wrap this topic up, I think the team that people misdiagnosed the most was probably Flash Wolves coming out of their region. Mm-hmm. What was something that we, as expert analysts, missed about this team? Or was there, like, an indicator that we should have known that there was almost this bubble around the team that was going to burst when they got to international play? Was it that they were fraudulently kind of getting these leads that we were talking about, where they just kind of, like, Maple gets a solo kill and now he's roaming the map and it looks really good and they're running teams over? Or was there maybe any way that we could have been like, hold on, let's temper our expectations a little bit more with this team? They're actually not as good as we think.
I think part of it was just when they went to IEM, they looked super good. So that was, like, a buff that people had on them going into this tournament. Because when we did have this discussion on the show, like, our Flash was overrated. And we even looked at a specific play where it was like they were just abusing a very obvious mistake that HQ made, right? Like, and that's how you get the leads. And so for me, I thought that they were a bit overrated, but I underestimated just how overrated they were. And part of that I do think was the IEM thing. Part of that I also think was that Flash Wolves, they played very differently, actually. Like, if you look at the mid picks that they were prioritizing for Maple until the last day of the tournament, right? They were very different. And then the last day, they kind of went back to some of these other things. The last 2 days where they beat SKT and everything else, they were prioritizing much more like Maple-esque mid picks. And suddenly his laning stats weren't the worst of every mid laner in the tournament anymore. So, I mean, there were a couple of issues with Flash was going in, but I do think that, if you are seeing a team getting leads off of very obvious mistakes made by your opponents, you need to temper your expectations more, I think, also.
All right, well, we're going to close up on that subject. We're going to move into some roster news, starting with Europe. I think, who wanted to talk about that one? Because I don't have on the sheet who it should be, but you're both Europe experts, and I'm absolutely not, So
I just wanted to do a kind of catch up on some of the EU roster changes for the people who watch the show. The big one so far has been the one where Misfits have picked up Max Lore over Kakao. And we here at Yahoo Esports have always been big Maxler fans, you know? Big no. So
I don't even know if that's a joke. I was like, are you?
It's like, well, we picked him as third for our all-pro team, and people yelled at us for not picking
People got really mad at
so.
us for not picking Cacao.
Oh, it's okay. So you think, I mean, for some ignorant fan, a lot of people hear the name Cacao and they're like, oh my God, it's the guy who carried KTA like way back, and he's a beast. What was he like in Europe? And then like, is Maxlore an upgrade, or was there like team issues? Why do you think this change happened?
So my thing with Cacao is I actually do think Cacao was a bit overrated a little. I think Cacao doesn't seem to ever know where the enemy jungler is. Like, even if it's something really simple, like after first back, the enemy jungler will probably go Grumps on this particular or go Krugs on this particular champion. Then he'll try to invade the Krugs with the enemy lane pushed out and get punished for it. And things like this sort of situations where he would just do repeatedly. But he was really good at like the whole dive bomb bottom lane gank super early thing that everyone likes with really flashy junglers, right? So that's something that he was doing really well early on. But as the games went on, like they needed him to play more engaged champions throughout the season, and he didn't adapt as well to that type of role. So, or teamfight engaged champions. So he didn't adapt as well to that type of role, and that became an issue. I also think for Cacao, even when I interviewed him when he was on IG, the Invictus Gaming team, he said that he thinks that it's really difficult for a jungler to be an import, because if you don't speak the language, you have to communicate with a bunch of other lanes, and communication is more important for you as a jungler. So it's actually the hardest role to be an import on if you don't speak the native language. So I think that communication issues, or just like him talking in comms as much, was also a problem with that team.
So you think it's going to work out better for Misfits now with the change, or is there any concerns like Maxwell is just not as good or anything like that?
I think this is a really good move. Yeah. I think Maxlore is actually well praised for his comms, so if that's something that they're lacking, I think he's, for me, the third best jungler in EU is between him and Memento, and I think Memento is a bit more creative, and Maxlore may be a bit more formulaic in his pathing and his decision making, but he's really good at playing with his laners and off his laners, and I think it's an overall like a good change. So.
And then what were some of the other changes that happened? Was that the big one?
Vander to Team Vitality was a big one also. They actually officially announced that we've decided we're doing all EU and therefore we're kicking our Koreans. It was kind of a weird announcement. Weird. It wasn't exactly like that, but it did come off a little weird. But they picked up Yamato Cannon and Vander. So I think Vander is a good choice. Like Team Vitality obviously shuffled through a lot of supports throughout. Like they did Nuke Duck, they did AOD, they did Hachani. But it's like
Hachani,
we know.
Oh God. That was a signing I knew was not going to work out.
That's one of those scouting ones you're talking about, right?
Yes, it actually is, because like, oh man, so many people love to shit on Hachani just because like he's really well known for face checking brushes and stuff like that. So his mistakes are really visible, right? But like, if you actually look into like why, say, KT picked him up again, or like why other players, because he coached the Freak of Freaks before Coach Kong came on and took over that team, and all of the players were like, before they were the Freak of Freaks, when they were Anarchy, they were like, yeah, Hachani, like he's great, like, you know, we love him, he like tells us what to do, and like Arrow said this when he was back in Korea, like I love Hachani because he just tells me what to do, and like basically Hachani's like a really good communicator, and he is one of those players who'll sometimes lose track of other things, so that's why you do see him like just straight up dying because he face checks brushes. And so obviously, like, you take a player who isn't known for his mechanics and he's known for his communication, and then you import him where you take out the one strength he has. yes, I could have told you that would not work out so well. So I am glad they got Vander because I like Vander. I think he's a good sport, and I hope it works out for them.
Vitality.
Oh, you go ahead.
Vitality to me is just the saddest story. Honestly, like they were a top 3 team in 2016 spring, right? Like they were working really well. They seem to be doing well. They get to playoffs. They get blown out of the water, according to them, because they didn't really understand or adapt to the meta well. I mean, people told them effectively that they had a weird conception in their head of what the meta was, and they should have just played 1-3-1 anyway. But they bombed out of the tournament. They decided to do these like 2 terrible roster downgrades, right? With Police and Mighty Bear, like barely avoid getting relegated in summer. And I'm just like, you didn't have to do that, guys.
Were those moves like...
I totally forgot about the Police and Mighty Bear days, to be honest. I just kind of like neglected to remember them.
Some of those moves you look at and you're like, were they forced into doing something and these were the best 2 people they could find? Was that the case with the Police and Mighty Bear move where like after they got blown out in playoffs, a couple players like, I want to look at other options? Or was it like the org was like, no, we need to find upgrades, these 2 guys?
Vitality was really weird because their PR on the Hjarnan thing was like one of the weirdest examples of PR I've ever seen, where they said that we had to part ways with PR with Hjarnan because Hjarnan was having trouble sleeping or having issues with insomnia, and Hjarnan saw the announcement, posts on Twitter, it's like, I can sleep fine. So you know that there's something weird going on there. And then they tried to use that excuse again when they benched Hachani. They were like, Hachani is having trouble sleeping, and you're just like, what's going on?
Maybe there's like a mistranslation. They don't know what sleeping means. They mean like he has trouble communicating, but they just keep saying sleeping.
So I do think because of the way they handled the Hjarnan announcement, that it was more someone deciding that they needed to replace Hjarnan for some reason, and they needed to replace Shook for some reason, and then they made a mad grab for, oh, this guy is ranked highly on the Korean ladder or something, and they just forced him. Because, like, I do think it's really dangerous to do major roster changes between spring and summer split. There just isn't enough time, so.
Right. And so any of these ones you think gonna work out and like really shake up the EU LCS positioning at all, or is it mostly set?
I think the Maxler Misfits one could be really important. It could make them a Worlds contender team because they were already kind of almost top 4. Mm-hmm. Depending on where you rank about the other teams that they didn't play and things like this, like H2K. But I think that this could very easily make them a Worlds team. So, yeah.
All right. So then we'll move on to the North American roster swap that everyone was talking about this week. CLG picked up Dardoch and traded Xmithie to Immortals. So obviously the side that everyone's talking more about is the Dardoch side going to CLG. I think that's where we'll start off. This was a really weird move to me just because CLG has always been talked about as kind of like the power of friendship team. Everything's hunky-dory and we just believe in each other and try really hard and blah, blah, blah. And Dardoch is like the exact opposite player that you've ever heard about his time on TL. They had a whole movie made about how toxic this kid was. And then Immortals, as he was like kind of leaving, they let like a couple things slip in their goodbye video where they showed him not having a great attitude. And now he's going to CLG, where their last 2 roster swaps have been done specifically to make the team environment better, with Pobelter, who didn't want to be a part of the 6-man situation or whatever and was apparently having friction with that, and then Double famously before that. So it's a little weird to see this happen where they just like, all right, this time we need a mechanical upgrade. Let's get Dardoch. That just seems weird to me.
It's odd, but like at the same time, so I guess you have to, how you feel about this move is going to depend on how much you trust that the other members of CLG will be able to, I guess, cushion the blow from like Dardoch being so like outspoken. The thing about Dardoch when he was on Immortals though is that he is like a voice, right? Like, so he's a strong voice. And on that team you have probably like Aphromu, who is it's kind of like from what I understand, it's kind of a democratic thing, but I think Afro and possibly Huhi would probably be the two kind of voices on the team that you'd point out. So I think having a strong voice is going to be interesting. And then it also just depends on how much you think like the rest of CLG, so like the other 4 members of the team, have grown together over the past year or so, or even before that. Because like at the time when they got rid of Double Lift, I think that's really when Afremu kind of came into his own as like a team leader and a shot caller. It's something that CLG previously had said like they wished he would step up more because he does have such a good voice and he's a very calming influence in comms. This is something they said like way before, like season 4, I think. But like I think that how you feel about this depends on how much you believe that Tony will be able to like handle it and just be like, no. And then the rest of the team will be able to handle it and how well he'll fit in. Because I think like, honestly, if Dardoch is in an environment that allows him to express his opinion without either like taking it too far, it'll actually be really good for him. Whether that's CLG, it's actually really going to be an interesting test for Tony, I think, as a coach. So I don't know. I'm actually curious about the Xmithie side of it as well, but I don't know if you guys have anything else to say about Dardoch.
Before we transition to the Immortals Xmithie side, the one thing I'll say is like there's 2 worlds where it's like one, Dardoch has personality issues, blah blah blah, team implodes, they suck, and that's a pretty likely scenario. You're looking at like a 50-50 situation, even maybe more sided to that one because it's happened apparently twice, where he signs a 3-year contract with Immortals and now he's not on the team anymore. Well, how'd that happen? And then, so like, let's say, that situation doesn't happen. That's pretty easy to expect. If it does happen, things go wrong. But even if it does work out, I'm not sure I love his play style for CLG. They like are an extremely scrappy team, and you'd be like, okay, mechanical upgrade over Xmithie. They should win more of these skirmishes and stuff. But I think they would benefit from like slowing down sometimes. Where they're getting aced. Like that was their thing during the end of the regular season. Was like, we're gonna get aced before 20 minutes. Yeah. Like, no, you guys are fighting too much. And Dardoch is not the guy who's going to slow that down. He's the guy who's going to like force more of those situations. So I don't love that idea. And a lot of Xmithie's like early pathing seemed to be like decided by Tony and like the coaching staff, or like how to get small advantages through like set plays early on. And I don't know if Dardoch's the type of player to follow that kind of stuff. He's much more of like an instinctual guy. So I'm a little suspect.
I have a lot of Dardoch empathy, I think, just based on the fact that from interviews and things like this, the impression I've gotten of him is just that he was constantly forced in these situations where he's a new player. He doesn't necessarily want to be the leader. He doesn't necessarily, but he wants to win so much, or he wants to improve so much, that he does end up taking over those responsibilities in a lot of these situations anyway, right? He ends up being the shot caller and the captain, even though in the IMT Welcome Dardoch video, he's like, I knew I was joining a team where I didn't have to lead if I didn't want to. And then lo and behold, he kind of does. So I think that this might be a better environment for him and he might be surprisingly more willing to work with a coach who has an idea of like how to set up the jungle pathing and things like this, as long as it's like maybe CLG might be too carefree for him, but other than that, and I don't actually know enough about the CLG environment to comment on that at all. Maybe the love and friendship will be too much and he'll just like choke on it, but otherwise I think it might be better if there are like experienced players who are sharing the burden of like leadership with him a little bit more.
Right, that's definitely something that he's had to do, which I don't think he's necessarily wanted, is just be like the most vocal player on the team at all points, which he is a very vocal guy, but I think he would enjoy someone else being like, we're going to do this game. And he can just sit back. Let's flip it over to the Immortals Xmithie side. What I would say is my first impression is like Dardoch brings a style to your team and you play the Dardoch way, but that doesn't mean that like the other 4 guys can't play another style. Like you don't have to necessarily play the way Dardoch played. So like Immortals were a very scrappy team, live or die by the jungler, a lot of early game fights, blah, blah, blah. You bring in Xmithie, maybe they turn into a more controlled style where like they play around their bot lane, getting smaller advantages. Their bot lane was decent by the end. Maybe they build on that existing synergy and Pobelter returns to control mages and they play like a controlled style. I don't think that's totally out of the realm of possibility.
I think it's interesting because you're going from, so like even if Dardoch didn't want to be a voice, he became the voice of the team, right? And Xmithie, from talking to him, I think it's interesting that you say like he does a lot of pathing that's handed down from Tony, because the impression I get from talking to him is that he is also actually a very instinctive jungler. When you ask him about like why he does certain things, a lot of it is usually based on experience, because he is incredibly experienced. Like people forget that he's been playing since forever.
XDG?
And yeah. And so I think that like it's an interesting move for me because he's definitely, if they need a strong voice from the jungle, I don't necessarily think he's going to be it. But I do think there are certain things he is good at, like, again, playing a more controlled, either like farming or counter jungling style that could help out Immortals, provided that they find another voice on the team. Because just based on what I like talking to him and based on what I know, I don't think Xmithie is going to be that voice for you. So that's where I worry about Immortals, because like if Dardoch was the only one who was stepping up and being like, okay, here's what we're going to do, because no one else was, and now you have a jungler who probably isn't going to do that, that could be a recipe for disaster if no one steps up, right?
Right. So you'd say the voice is a concern. And then I think there's a little bit of a concern about just lack of talent. Like maybe they do transition to this controlled style, but like, do you really have enough firepower between Flame, who seems to have issues getting on the same page with his team? He admits that like communication was an issue the whole time and figuring out what his teammates were saying. And then Pobelter and Cody being your two primary threats. There might be a little bit of a concern there, but I'm just saying that I don't think you have to play Dardoch's way with Xmithie now. You can try and find another style for your team.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Anything to add, Kelsey? Are you good on that?
I'm good. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will give our final thoughts on some of the bracket stage matchups coming up in the rest of MSI. And then we'll do a little bit of Q&A as well. So stick around after the break.
That's it, I quit.
I'm so sorry. There's no way you get that.
I started to get these really bad chronic migraines. I still have them to this day, but at the time they were really bad.
Late end of middle school, he started getting sick in the schools and mostly just having headaches every day. And so he could kind of wake up and just feel bad.
It came to a certain point where like I wouldn't go to school because of the headache, and then because I had already missed like a week of school straight, I would be so like nervous, I guess, to go back to school. I would keep missing school, keep missing more and more school, to the point where they said I had to start going or I would fail out.
He just was miserable all the time. They took him to doctors and specialists, and there was definitely something wrong, but no one could really say what it was. And meanwhile, I had the school nurse on my case every day that he wasn't there. And the county and the state are gonna be contacting you because he's missing too much school. It was really a tough time, and just worried sick that something was really wrong.
Welcome back, everybody. It's time for Kelsey and Emily's favorite part of the show, predictions.
Yeah.
They're great at them. So the two matchups that we're going to get this weekend are going to be between Flash Wolves and SKT, and WE and G2, which I think is probably the best two matchups you could hope for. A lot of people were talking about Flash Wolves being the Korea killers, and even though they kind of underperformed during the group stage, they did still take a game off SKT, so I think that's an exciting matchup. And then WE versus G2, both being a little bit slower in the early game and kind of matching up with some of their strengths, with Mystic and Sven being two of the better AD carriers, along with Bang, obviously, at this tournament. So starting with the Flash Wolves SKT one, talk to me about how you guys think this matchup's going to shake out.
I think SKT is going to win.
Riveting!
I know. I mean, I think
3-1.
Yeah.
I'll give it a 3-1.
Flash Wolves, so this is a big if they don't go into it with the mindset that they have to play this certain way, and if they do what they were doing towards the end of the group stage, and getting those picks for Maple and actually doing things, I think that they could take a game, because they are, when they play to their strengths, they are good enough to take a game off of SKT. Are they good enough to take a series? I don't think so. I don't see it happening, but I'm glad we get this matchup, just because I think that I've wanted to see these two teams in a best of 5 for a while. So I'm hoping that the games are somewhat competitive, because it has the potential to be a good series if Flash Wolves play to their strengths.
So you mentioned playing to their strengths is a big part. I think a lot of people would say well, doesn't SKT have to underperform, or is it really just the case where if Flash Wolves play a great game and SKT is playing well, that Flash Wolves actually has a chance to win? Or is it kind of crutch on Peanut does something dumb, hands Karsa a kill, and then they have this kind of early game comp that they're able to run away with? Or is it really if they just get good matchups and they make their own plays, they'll win?
I think the way Flash Wolves played against SKT in the game that they won was actually really smart, in terms of what they decided to do, which was to actually just control the mid lane really well. Just not gank it or set it up super hard, but just have a strong matchup, and then keep it so that Faker is a little bit more confined. He can't go, because one thing that SKT do is that if the jungle shows bot or something like this, or by shows bot I mean makes a play on bot, or if the enemy team makes a play on bot, then Faker will go super aggressive or something like this. So that his movements in that sense are confined, and then they snowballed top and kind of just ignored the bottom lane, because I probably will get a little bit of ire for saying I think Bang is a really good player, but he's not gonna super hard carry every game, right? Especially not in the current meta. So I think that strategy actually works really well, to just focus much more on pinning down the sidelines for SKT, making sure that top can't interfere with mid by putting more jungle pressure on top, and then just keeping Faker confined to a situation where he gets pushed in on a little bit more, and then even if your bot lane dies a few times, I think it's fine. So I think that was a really smart strategy. So that's something that I'm not sure that we can just discount, because I think that strategy could even work again. Mm-hmm. So that's why I will give Flash Wolves a game, because I think it's a very basic way to set up playing against SKT. It's not super complicated, and I think they can pull it off at least one more time. But I do think SKT is a good adaptation-based team, and they'll do something in draft, or they'll do something with mid and jungle pressure, and they'll prevent Faker from getting tied down too much. So.
One of the things that people said about that game that Flash Wolves did win was the fact that they had a great draft for themselves, and people sometimes comment on the fact that SKT during group stage might get a little disrespectful with what they do in draft, almost like it's a scrim, and they're just leave everything open, let them get some comfort picks, we'll see how we play against them. And that game kind of felt like that. Do you think Flash Wolves get as good of a draft in the actual best of 5, or will SKT kind of just shut it all down?
Maybe in game one.
I
think in game one they tend to be a little bit more open to that type of thing as well. So we'll see.
You have anything you're gonna add there, Emily? You started.
Oh no, I was gonna bring that up because like they're known for kind of like flaking out in the first, not like flaking out, but doing exactly what you said, like just being like, okay, throw everything at us, and then now we're going to adapt and just destroy you. So I do think there's a chance that SKT does give away some of those picks in draft because they've done it before.
All right, so then how about the other side of the bracket? Flash Wolves WE versus G2. Talk to me about how you think that one's going to go.
I think WE has, if G2 don't do something to address their lack of an early game, Team WE are going to like absolutely crush them. That being said, like I'm not sure if that will happen. Like I'm still giving it a 3-1, but like WE have proved over the course of this tournament and also in the LPL that when Condi does open up those opportunities for them early, and they really understand how to play around his pressure, I think. And I had previously criticized G2, although like I don't necessarily think that they were wrong for approaching TSM that way, because if they have confidence that they can outplay TSM late, and that's the way they want to approach it, that's fine. But I don't think that approach is ever going to work on Team WE because they will attack you before that happens. And so something really drastic has to happen to get Trick involved with his lanes, or for them to prioritize more like pushing lanes at all times. Something has to give in the early game for that to be a really close series. So I'm giving it to Team WE.
I think it's not even that they don't necessarily get pushing lanes. It's just that I think their coordination with jungle and mid and like making priority moves, or Trick not necessarily accounting for what happens when the jungle collapses on mid and I'm top, or things like this, are a little bit more of the issue. And I think that's harder to fix because it's been something that's been a problem with them since even summer of last year. So I think it's really hard to predict that they will fix it. And on paper, these should be incredibly similar teams. Mm-hmm. Like just in terms of not even just like where their strengths and weaknesses lie in terms of players, but also how they set up and where they get the agency from their jungler, and the fact that they can both like build compositions and have both built compositions that are based on like winning fights around Baron and late game and setting up those lanes. And I think WE is a little bit better at managing side lane pressure. So I think that like you have to just say WE is a better G2, so they win. I don't know.
So I think two of the mismatches that people talk about in terms of individual players would be 957 versus Expect, where a lot of the time Expect is just stuck on tanks, and it feels like 957 can play a little bit more of the carry style, where we've seen his Kled absolutely go off at MSI so far. And then we talk about Condi obviously getting the better of Trick. Do you think the top side of the map, which isn't seemingly heavily focused too much by either team, do you think that's an area that WE should attack more in the early game, or are they fine just kind of playing how they've been playing so far and going kind of more mid-late game where they're just going to be better than G2?
I think that, I mean, they have been putting a lot of jungle pressure on top this tournament in general as well. So I think that that's a fine strategy. I think, again, they're pretty flexible in terms of, like, based on their composition, like, how they want a path. But they just have to get the strong lanes. And I can kind of see G2 getting a game where WE just forget what they're good at again. So, but it's fine. I think the way that they have been playing is actually more towards top side with the Kled and the top snowball anyway, so it's fine.
So G2, how do they win this? Because it sounds like they have a worse early game, they have a worse mid to late game, their players not necessarily much better, and we talked about Trick having a better performance, but do they need to like really, and we talked about some pushing lanes and stuff, but do they really need to go like all in on an early game strategy and totally change up how they're playing from group stage, or can they just get like, you know, a couple thousand goal lead and then with that kind of safety buffer win in the mid late game?
Yeah, I don't even think
don't
it's
think
necessarily about early game. I think it's just about it's about having an early game strategy. It's just about understanding what to do when your mid is pushed out, like how you can use that. Like for example, if you're gonna gank top, and the enemy jungle is like towards mid area but bot, like maybe you take the priority of the mid and you roam with the mid laner towards top. Things like this, just like little things like this, I think have constantly been an issue for G2 that they can fix, but just haven't. And so just using perks in conjunction with Trick a little bit better, like understanding that there's a difference between having the best jungle and mid in a region and having the best mid jungle in a region,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So of the two, because it sounds like both you guys are saying 3-1s, WE and SKT, which series will be closer?
That is a good question.
Because we think about SKT as like clearly the best team of the tournament. They're going to smash everybody. But it sounds like based off the analysis I was hearing that like WE is going to crush G2 because they're just a better team and very similar. Whereas at least Flash Wolves is a different team than SKT and can maybe exploit some weaknesses. So does that mean that?
It's actually super frustrating because like you're like, so if everyone plays at their top level, like so
Sure.
all teams, right? Like all 4 teams play like the best to their ability. I'd actually say that the Team WE G2 series would be less close because I do think that if they play to their understanding, and that being said, I still don't think that either G2 or Flash Wolves would win. But in terms of being close and looking like close games, I think that Flash Wolves would give SKT a better run for their money than G2 would give Team WE. But that's assuming that WE don't like randomly draft all losing lanes, which is not something I can necessarily rely on them like to not do, right? Or like relying on Flash Wolves to actually play to like their team strengths. I can't rely on them to do that either. So
right. I mean,
I will just say WEG2 is going to be closer. Like, screw it. I think like we'll have some team fights and it'll be fun. And, maybe G2 makes some comebacks. So, yeah, it's good. We'll go WEG2.
Okay. So we'll go with that one. And now just to close the show out, almost out of time, we'll do a question from chat. It's Not Gonna Lurk. He asked, do you think making the group stage best of 2 or best of 3 instead of best of 1 would help stabilize these crazy fluky group stages that we've been having in international LoL events lately? And you guys can start off. I have my own opinions about this, but let me know what you guys think first.
I mean, I've been pretty outspoken that I'm not a huge fan of best of 1s. Mm-hmm. In terms of, do I think it would make it less like fluky or crazy? Not necessarily. Although I do think you'd be able to track adaptation a lot better. Because if teams are playing the same team in a row, like that's how you see storylines develop even within like a best of 5, right? So, and even the same thing happens in best of 2s and 3s. So I think you would just see a little bit more like visible understanding and adaptation. It wouldn't necessarily mean that there would be less like you still might see like teams like trading wins and stuff just because like one team would adapt and be able to counter the other team. The overall level of play though I think would increase.
I have the opinion that, at least for this event, I don't think it would have changed that much. It felt like a lot of the teams were just like legitimately not playing well, and it wasn't like oh my god, they freaked me out with this one pick and now I'm going to lose, the way it was kind of Worlds last year with a team like ANX where they had the brand support and this kind of weird stuff. Not as much this time around. And the competitive side of me is like, yeah, we should absolutely have best of 2 and 3s. No one even uses these anymore anywhere in the world, and now we're using them to decide the most important international tournaments. That sounds a little ridiculous, but at the same time, the NA fan of me is like, yo, we need best of 1 upsets. Otherwise, we're going to get crushed. But
you are the problem.
No, I would, if they change it, I'd be like, great, this is excellent for the competitiveness of these tournaments. But the other side of me is like, it was a good run, NA. We've done well. Kelsey, you have any thoughts on it?
Nah, I mean, I think in general, I like the idea of best of twos and best of threes, but if you have a multiple round robin group stage, I think it's still okay. It's fine. I mean, I don't think it'll be that significantly different. So.
Right. All right. That's going to be the one question from chat this time. We ran a little late, but before we go, we have to ask Emily for her anime pick of the week.
Oh.
What should we watch this week, Emily?
So I wasn't here last week. And the anime pick of the week that I want to recommend isn't up on Netflix yet, as far as I know, which is Little Witch Academia, and I can't recommend anything that you would have to pirate. So I'm going to go with a favorite of mine. I'm not sure how many people would actually like this series, but I think it is very well done. It's very affecting if you get into it, and it has fantastic cinematography. It's called Kyosu Giga, and you can watch it on Crunchyroll. And it's really weird and wacky and crazy. And I actually don't think many people will like it.
How do you spell that? Like, even if you recommended them, I like, what? Post that one on Twitter or something?
I'll type it. Yeah.
Or yeah, if you're in the chat, you can spell it there.
Oh, I'm not actually. I didn't sign into my thing, but it's KYOUSOUGIGA. And anyway,
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm totally looking that up right now.
Yep, I can see right there typing in. Okay. Nice one, Kelsey. All right, so Emily, if people wanted to follow you for this anime, in case they didn't catch it, what you just said there, where should they follow you? And then what else are you up to this week before the finals of MSI?
Yeah, so I'm in Brazil for the rest of this week. You can follow me at League of Emily. I'll be coming out with a lot more interviews. I'm also writing a gigantic feature on the Marines. So look forward to that because I think it's going to turn out really well. I had some awesome interviews with those guys. So.
And Kelsey, since you're probably not too busy watching anime, what else are you going to be doing this week?
Yeah, so obviously I'm expected to have a very good G2 versus WE preview, naturally. I think other than that, I'll be doing a lot more articles, hopefully, on the group stage because I found it very interesting, so it'll be fun.
Sounds good. And if you want to follow me, I'm the Mark Z on Twitter. I'll just be putting out maybe a video or two about the group stage so far, and then that's about all I have this week. Next week, we'll be back again, but on Wednesday, just to buy some time for people to get back from Brazil, all that stuff, because as we said, Travis and Emily still there, and we want to get them back here in the studio for the show. That's going to do it for this week of League Weekly, though. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and can't wait to see you guys next week.